Steve Jones sat on the back terrace, watching the sunset on the sea. Perhaps they should have moved here years ago. The beauty and tranquility of the place was mesmerizing. Here, being to a small island off the north coast of Cornwall. Throughout most of their 22 years of marriage, Steve's wife Claire had hinted, persuaded, and finally talked him into moving from London to here, where she and countless generations of her family had grown up. Improved communications and technology, and finally the COVID, allowed him to do enough work from home to make it viable and to limit his trips to the capital to once a month. Claire, on the other hand, while living in London, returned to the island regularly to visit family and friends, and most importantly, to see her mother. They had bought a house from Claire's cousin 2 years ago, but only moved in 6 months ago. In the meantime, Claire had spent her visits renovating it, using it as a base once the major construction work was completed. The house overlooked the bay to the west and had a spectacular sunset, which Steve admired while sipping a cool beer. The property was an old farmhouse, and there were still meadows and orchards nearby. It looked like a few new trees had been planted, no doubt part of the landscaping Claire had done last spring. The trees and orchards seemed to be typical of the whole island, and Steve wondered if they were intended as shelter from the strong sea breezes, or more likely, to produce the cider so beloved of the locals. He had to admit it was a good move. Claire was right. It was a different pace of life amongst close quarters, many of whom were Claire's relatives. Claire was glad to be back home and seemed to know everyone on the island. Being an outsider, Steve sensed a certain coldness on the part of the locals, but he liked their direct mannerisms. The way everyone took to the task in a friendly manner was impressive, and he wondered if it had something to do with the independence needed for the small island community to survive. Steve had met Claire at university. Both were studying business, Claire specializing in marketing and Steve in new technologies. They developed a strong relationship and married shortly after graduating, deciding to live in London for better work opportunities. Married for 22 years now, Steve still thinks Claire is beautiful. Her hair had gotten shorter over time, now tucked back and ending at the back of her head, and a golden hue had been added to the usual blonde color. He knew she was worried about the 4.5 pounds she'd put on over the years, but he liked that her figure had rounded out, her hips and bust more plump. Her eyes remained unchanged, gray-blue with yellow speckles in the iris. Unlike Steve, she never looked disheveled or dapper in sweatpants, maintaining a classic look. He had never seen his wife so happy, involved in island life and constantly involved in one committee or another. Her current project involved organizing a solstice festival. Their 2 daughters, Nicole and Michelle, were born just after the wedding, are now grown and off to study at Durham University. This was another factor that prompted Steve and Claire to make the move. Judging by their social media feeds, the girls were thoroughly enjoying university life. But Steve was sure they had time to do all the work they needed to do, although Nicole had a tendency to leave everything to the last minute. Steve was interested in the history of the island and enjoyed listening to old fishing stories in the local pub. There were several old books published that gave an insight into the history of the island. These were kept in the small schoolhouse which served as the library, as well as the village hall and venue for all social events. Steve looked through the attic of his house for the first time, thinking he might be able to find something more about the history of the place. There were mostly old beds, furniture, and toys. Digging around, he found an old box that held a handwritten manuscript called Tales from the Island. He made out the author's name, Melissa Taylor, and immediately discovered that it was his wife's last name. He sat down on a wicker stool and began leafing through. The handwriting was beautiful, a traditional font with swirls and strokes, and the content was a mixture of stories passed down from generation to generation and the author's experiences. Steve's attention, as he flipped through the pages, was drawn to the drawings of trees. His eyes ran over the content. Some was faded and hard to make out, but he could catch snippets. The tradition was founded in 1287. It was then, during the reign of the Plantagenets, that the law of the first night, also known as the jus primae noctis, law of the first night, was enforced. As part of the wedding license, the reigning lord had the right to spend the first night with any new bride within his lands. Steve could recall a similar reference in a movie about William Wallace starring Mel Gibson, but was sure it was a myth conveniently picked up by Hollywood to add some voyeurism and titillation to the movie plot. Steve continued reading. Seeing the suffering this caused the groom, and to prevent any attempt at murderous revenge, the women elders would spend one night with the groom. Over time, this evolved into one of the older women sleeping with the groom to ensure some parity for the couple. For 2.5 centuries, plague dominated English life, decimating the population. The island was not immune to the disease, and there were many deaths. After a severe epidemic in 1622, there were fears that the island's population was unsustainable, and serious consideration was given to abandoning the island. Sometime after this, rumors of a Fool's Day switch of partners surfaced. This was linked to efforts to repopulate the island, and widows were encouraged to seek partners among the younger men. With the outbreak of the Great War, almost all of the island's men enlisted in the PAL's divisions of the British Army. Many young men did not return, so the island's tradition was changed to provide a surrogate partner before conscription for young, unmarried men going off to war. This practice was resumed to a lesser extent during World War II. The text goes on to detail Melissa's own experiences in the 1950s. The arrival of non-locals and displacement of people undermined the tradition, but it still exists between some families. The elders insist that it is a tradition and that it has value. Married women who have raised children are offered surrogacy for a young man who has reached the age of 18. Men are relieved of all the worry and pressure of losing their virginity. They also receive guidance from an experienced woman and end up being better husbands in the future. Divorce is unheard of on the island. This tradition also reduced the chances of unwanted pregnancies during adolescence. For women, it was seen as part of community service with a hint of reward after years of hard work raising children. The tradition also reduced the impact of the empty nest and the likelihood of illicit relationships. Melissa went on to describe her own surrogacy for fine young gentlemen who had reached the age of 18, at which time she was 46. When her husband was busy with the business, a young man, Robert, worked on their small property planting trees as a sign of renewal as part of the festival. His reward was time in Melissa's marital bed. The text gives the impression that Melissa's husband knew but never spoke of this arrangement. She described Robert's development from a shy and awkward teenager to a man. The first time was quick and awkward, but Melissa kept him close, slowly making love. As the week went on, his abilities and confidence grew. There was more than just the physical side of things. She explained to him her desires and feelings and the important aspects of maintaining a successful relationship. Steve shook his head. Wow, what an amazing story, and began to wonder how much of it was true. He could see some reason in the historical references, but it all seemed too far-fetched. It could have all been the author's imagination, or she could have used it to justify her novel. A few months later, Steve was deciding when he needed to get back into town for work. Claire had a long list of shopping she wanted him to do, so he decided it was best to add a day for that, and another to meet up with old friends. If he went after the festival, he could be back by next Saturday. Claire was thrilled, no doubt because of the fact that Steve would be around to help with preparations for the festival, and that he had agreed to do her shopping. The festival day involved the whole island, with the focus during the day being on children's games and sports, with dancing and drinks planned for the adults in the evening. As the evening program began, Steve was introduced to some islanders he had not yet met, including John Fraser, his wife Angela, and their son Jake, who Steve thought was close to the age of his youngest daughter. Jake Fraser introduced himself with a rather formal handshake, which was a bit odd, but that moment soon passed. Along with Taylor, Fraser was one of the oldest families on the island. Steve felt like an outsider again while Claire and the Frasers discussed old family ties. Later that evening, Steve noticed a group of young men looking at Claire. He couldn't blame them. Claire looked stunning in the summer dress she had chosen, certainly showing off her full breasts and slender calves. The stares continued, which started to annoy Steve. He was about to approach, but Claire's mother beat him to it, making them all hurry back to the bar with the cider. Steve laughed to himself, thinking that they must be a little wary of Claire's mom, Diane, Then again, he couldn't blame them. She's a formidable woman and leader of the Council of Elders. Steve could see where Claire got her looks from. Diana Taylor remained a striking woman, looking more like Claire's older sister than her mother. He went back to watch the dancing, which seemed to involve all ages. Steve felt the effects of the cider, but decided he could drink some more. Everyone seemed to be in the same mood, and it took him forever to get a treat. When he returned, he didn't see Claire and started looking around. He was surprised to find her sitting at the table talking to Jake Fraser, who had stepped away when Steve approached. "What are you two talking about?" Steve asked. "Jake is interested in doing some landscaping work. I was asking about options and cost." "Do we have work to do?" "Yes, and there is a tradition of planting and renewing trees around the time of the festival, so that would be great." The mention of trees brought back memories of a manuscript Steve had read a few weeks ago. "So, will Jake be planting trees?" "Yes, he can start next week." Claire looked at Steve. "Are you okay? It looks like you saw a ghost." Steve slowly replied, "What will Jake get in return?" "Steve. Money, of course, but we haven't agreed on the amount yet." "And won't you provide some other services in exchange for his work?" "What are you implying?" Steve continued. "So what? It has nothing to do with the traditions of the island," Claire hissed. "What? What traditions? You know very well about the solstice tradition. Are you participating in it? Planning to screw Jake Fraser while I'm gone next week?" Claire burst into tears and ran away. Steve stood stunned. Hell, what if he was wrong and had just falsely accused Claire? He was beginning to regret drinking so much his mind was foggy and he couldn't think clearly. He began to walk up the single-track road to their house. He needed to walk to clear his head. This walk was the longest of his life. Maybe he had misunderstood something. Maybe he had overreacted to the story. When he got home, Claire wasn't home. He collapsed on the couch, the alcohol and fatigue finally taking over his thoughts, and he fell asleep. The next morning he noticed that Claire hadn't come home and thought she might have spent the night with her lover, but suspected she was at her mom's. That suspicion was confirmed when Claire and Diane appeared at the door. Her mother led the conversation, talking about not backing down. She launched a verbal attack on Steve. There were so many words it was hard to keep track, but the gist of it was, how dare he talk to Claire like that? How dare he upset her? Marriage to a stranger is no good. He was never good enough for her, and so on and so forth. He let her rant, looking at Claire with wet eyes. Finally, he had had enough and raised his hand, trying to get her mom to stop. "I have a simple question. Is there such a tradition? And are you planning on getting into bed with Jake Fraser next week?" Claire turned to her mother with a startled look, and Steve's cell became clear. "Yes, Steve, there is still a tradition, or at least part of it, in some of the older families. The Frasers have requested the fulfillment of the arrangement, and we are obligated to honor it." I asked Claire to think about it. It is about everything that has to do with a boy reaching maturity. Sex is only educational in nature and tells you how to treat a woman properly. It's not sex as you understand it, nor is it an affair. It's a centuries-old tradition that has seen the island through hard times. It is an absolute requirement that we fulfill this role on behalf of the community. We have no youth crime, no divorce, just happy marriages and families with strong ties. You've probably noticed that yourself. Steve sighed. So it's all true. Married women have eager young guys in the name of social good. Diana replied, "Don't be so vulgar. You're an outsider and you can't know how important it is to us. It's ingrained in every tale we hear growing up here. If you were from here, you would have gotten all the benefits at 18, and it would have made you a better man. I doubt you would have turned down that offer." Steve replied, "There are no ancient laws, plagues, or wars now. You do it because you enjoy it. Tell me, Diane, how many times have you performed this role? An attractive woman like you must have been asked to perform the arrangement several times. I'll bet you've had quite a few weeks of fun." Finally, Diana seemed at a loss for words, but then recovered. "Yes, I've fulfilled my duties on several occasions, and I'm proud of it, just as you should be proud of Claire's sacrifice. I beg you, Steve, let Claire do it. You can't realize how important it is to us." Steve turned to his wife. "So you want to do it?" I, uh, I think, yes, I'm willing to make that sacrifice. Like Mom said, I want to be part of the community. No one was happy when I left for university, got married, didn't come back here and fulfill my obligations that fell to others. Steve replied, "So this is a sacrifice? It's not something you yourself aspire to? It seems strange, considering you were so happy I was going to London, you were so excited." Claire blushed, then continued, "I was just relieved that I could arrange it and ensure that it wouldn't affect you. And it won't. I'm absolutely sure of that. It's not going to affect our relationship. Except for the sex with another man, the lies, the fact that other people will know what happened, and the fact that your clueless husband will be kept in the dark, you might be right." Claire and Diane grumbled at Steve's sarcastic response. Then Diane spoke up. "Why don't we all give ourselves time to calm down and talk things through? All the cards are on the table now, as they should be, and nothing has happened yet." Claire stayed at their house, but they hardly spoke at all. Steve just couldn't understand why Claire felt like she wanted to go through with this. He'd expected her to just dismiss the idea, but she seemed obsessed with the island tradition, regardless of its cost in part of their relationship. Claire insisted that if everything was out in the open, everything would be better. She promised to be honest with Steve, even if it meant difficult conversations. Part of what surprised Steve was her absolute faith and assertion that such an agreement wouldn't affect their relationship. Diane returned on Wednesday while Claire was in the village, and he suspected that they had agreed a time between them. "Can we have a word, Steve?" Steve nodded towards the kitchen table and they sat down. "Firstly, I'd like to apologize. It shouldn't have happened, and it's my fault, not Claire's." Steve replied, "Claire is more than capable of making her own decisions, and that decision seems to have already been made, regardless of my opinion. She loves you very much, and I'm sure you're strong enough as a couple to get through this." Steve replied glumly, "Actually, you both don't notice how much this is affecting me. It's the truest betrayal. I wasn't here when I was 18. And unlike the rest of you, I didn't live my life knowing that this could happen to my wife. I naively assumed that my wife would be faithful to me, as in wedding vows. I understand, Steve, and it must be incredibly difficult, hard to explain how differently we see things. We don't see it as infidelity. It's really important to us, and I know Claire sees it as a way to give back to the island community." After a bit of silence, Diane continued, "What are you going to do if she goes for it?" Steve sighed, not wanting to say the words, but said nonetheless, "I won't stand for it." Diana seemed to weigh the situation before she spoke. "What if there's a way to even things out? Maybe give you a chance to feel what you missed out on when you were 18. Steve must have looked as confused as he felt, Diane continued. "I spoke to the other two elders. We agreed that the elders would offer you an agreement similar to the one Claire is honoring." An epiphany finally flashed through Steve's mind. "Are you suggesting I have sex with Helen Brown or Moira Fraser?" Memories of meeting these two women flashed through Steve's mind. Helen was a widow from a young age. Steve assumed she was about his wife's age, with long black hair and deep brown eyes. She retained a trim figure and was certainly an attractive woman. Steve didn't know Moira Fraser that well, but he knew that she was happily married and related to the other Frasers. She is the principal of a small school. With mixed reddish-blonde curly hair, she has a more graceful figure, often showing off her ample cleavage. Steve broke away from his memories. "Yes, Steve, the elders are willing to offer this, and I hope it shows you how much this all means to us. We didn't just frivolously put Claire in this position." Despite the obvious temptation, Steve thought the whole proposal was absurd. "You're a striking woman, Diana, and an elder too. Aren't you on the menu too?" Diane hesitated, not sure if Steve was being serious. "If that's what it takes, Steve, then yes, I agree. I won't be the one responsible for the loss of centuries-old traditions." Steve shook his head, amazed at what Diana was willing to do. He had a horrible premonition of how he would try to explain this agreement to his father and the law. "You know, Diana, some traditions have outlived their usefulness, and that they should fade away is the right thing to do." Diane's smile faded. Our offer stands, Steve, and you won't be disappointed. I can guarantee it. Think carefully. When Steve retold the story to Claire, she seemed already aware of the elder's offer, but Diane's inclusion left her shocked, and she cried. I never thought she could think about it. It's all too much. I'm not doing this, Steve. All of this has to stop. Steve felt a wave of relief, finally acknowledging that this whole scenario was just plain weird. Thank God I can't tell you how relieved I am. I thought this was going to be the end of us. Claire cried and spent most of the night either apologizing or repeating how much she loved Steve. The situation remained awkward and unsure. Steve was still struggling with Claire's previous intentions, and her look that agreement was reasonable. On Friday, Diane returned, clearly furious at Claire's reconsideration, accusing Steve of being a manipulative bully and an outsider who could never understand her. Steve is tired of ranting. Why don't you be honest, Diane, and admit that this is just a way for you to bully your husband? Diane almost had a stroke. Okay, if you want to know the truth, we're having a great time. A fit young stud in our bed doing exactly what we say, and when we say it is a dream come true. We repeatedly give them everything, and everyone in the Fraser family is gifted as a horse. It's exhilarating, and they can't get enough of us. Can you believe that? Claire groaned. Jesus, Mom, shut up. You're ruining everything. Steve laughingly replied, Don't stop her. That's the most honest thing I've heard her say. Diane wanted to say something else, but Claire stopped her, telling her to leave and not to come back until she agreed with her decision. Steve saw Claire confront Diane for the first time and couldn't tell who was more shocked when Diane ran out of the house. Over the next few weeks, the situation remained complicated. Claire constantly apologized for even considering the arrangement and for asking Steve to accept it. She was bound to the tradition by her mom and didn't think about the consequences. Steve was faced with the dilemma of traveling to the city for work. He couldn't put it off any longer, but the thought of leaving Claire on the island horrified him. Claire sensed his anxiety and insisted on going with him, taking time off work. The rift with his mom became even greater. They didn't speak, and Claire never mentioned the tradition again. After much thought and worry, Steve decided that he needed to trust Claire and go on the trip alone. Claire tried again to convince Steve that she could go with him, but he knew that she was in the middle of working on a major marketing proposal and needed time to prepare. Claire promised daily calls and frequent contact. Steve set off for London. The ferry, cab, train, and subway had left him tired, and he collapsed on his hotel bed at 9 o'clock at night. He called Claire, she answered quickly, and they exchanged details of his trip and what had changed in the city during their long conversation. London was an endless stream of construction work. After the conversation, Steve fell asleep immediately, exhausted. He had had a busy few days at work, but he felt rested. Being off the island had helped him clear his thoughts. He began to ponder his relationship with Claire and mentally replay some of their conversations. The man who had been so passionate about trying to have a relationship with a younger man seemed as far removed from the woman he had married as he was from the caring mother of his children. He felt that Diana had too much influence over her and was glad that they had quarreled. She had gone too far, and he hoped that would be the end of it. Still, he couldn't reconcile himself with Claire's actions and why she was so sure that this agreement wouldn't affect their relationship, and those thoughts continued to bother him. Suddenly remembering the trees planted on his property the previous spring, Steve froze. Claire had traveled to the island regularly throughout the previous year. A feeling of horror swept over him as he thought of who might have planted those trees. Perhaps she had fought so hard for it this time because she needed to justify her previous actions. He called Claire and she answered quickly again. Steve began, "Doesn't Jake Fraser have an older brother?" There was a pause before Claire nonchalantly answered, "Yes, I think there is." "You just think even though your families go way back?" There was a pause. "Yes, Steve, he has a brother called Glenn." Steve continued, "He's about 19? Again, hesitation before she whispered quietly, "Yes." "And he was the one who planted the trees last year?" There was no answer. Steve continued, And what did Glenn Fraser get for that? Claire recovered from her thoughts. Just money, Steve. Their family is the only one on the island that does landscaping. So you're not entertaining Jake Fraser right now as we speak? Claire sighed. No, Steve, I'm not, and you need to get over this jealousy thing. Before she could say anything else, Steve hung up. The calls from Claire came repeatedly, but Steve ignored them all. He needed time to think. Finally, on Friday morning, he answered the phone, much to Claire's surprise. Steve, thank God you answered. I was worried. Really? Steve replied. Of course I love you more than anything in the world. What time will you be back tomorrow? Do we need to talk about this? Steve replied in a calm tone that worried Claire. I'm not coming back. I'm going to stay here for a while. Claire panicked. Please don't do that. We need to sort all this out as soon as possible. Steve replied again in an eerily calm tone. Oh, that's true, but you didn't rush to London to do it, and you only called me in the afternoon. I understand your evenings have remained somewhat busy. Please, Steve, come home. I haven't done anything. It's just your paranoia. Just come home and we can sort this out. 5 days later, Steve was taking the ferry back to the island. When he reached home, Claire was already waiting for him along with Diane. Obviously, the news had been relayed to her. Claire tried to hug and kiss him, but Steve pulled her away from him. Claire began to sob. Diane looked furious. Why are you here, Diane? This is between me and Claire. Am I to understand correctly that you two never had a fight in the first place? Before Diana could answer, Claire began to explain. We actually had a fight, but when you didn't come home, I needed someone, and you weren't here. Steve frowned. Right. It's hard to believe my mother-in-law would make up with someone if she didn't get her way. Given her efforts to reach an agreement, I doubt she'd back down. I suppose you never fought, and this was all a cover-up. Claire's eyes widened. This is getting out of hand, Steve. I didn't do anything. Steve continued. So you both agreed to lie and cover it up because I wouldn't go for it? The argument continued, but went in circles. Steve was sure that Claire had cheated, but she denied it. Eventually, he retired to the spare room and left Claire and Diane alone. The next day, Steve decided to meet with his father-in-law, Bill Taylor, knowing that the conversation would be difficult. They had always gotten along well, and Bill started with a friendly handshake, saying he was expecting Steve. They talked about tradition and what Bill had learned. Bill realized that about 20 years ago, Diane had spent one night with John Fraser. He didn't like it, but it was similar to a night he had enjoyed immensely when he was 18. Steve spent some time carefully laying out Diane's confession of several weeks of dating, asking if it was possible. Bill was upset, but said he'd always had a suspicion that something else was going on, and his departure for commercial fishing provided ample opportunity. Steve asked Bill if he knew about his daughter's actions. Bill confirmed that Diane and Claire were inseparable, but tried to keep the information from him. A week before Steve left for London, they had talked about having a plan in place. Claire sat at the kitchen table, unable to look at Steve. I can't believe my dad is going to divorce my mom, and that we're the reason for it. Diane made her own bed. Your father would never agree to that level of deceit and lies. She still denies everything even now, though John Fraser has admitted the truth, and he's not the only one. After a long silence, Claire whispered, I know, and that's why I think I have to tell you something. Steve didn't answer. I'm sorry, Steve, but I made a deal with Jake. The explosion Claire was expecting never happened. And last year with Glenn Fraser? Claire nodded silently. Steve couldn't think of what to say. Please, Steve, that shouldn't change us. We've had 22 fantastic years. How can you say that? It changes everything. I'm so sorry, Steve. I thought I had to fulfill a family obligation. Steve was seething with anger. What nonsense! You just wanted to fuck another man. You did it and enjoyed it so much you did it again. It wasn't like that. It was a duty. An obligation. So you didn't enjoy it? Claire hesitated, knowing she was on very dangerous ground. It was ordinary, not like us, just sex, not lovemaking. It was a one-off. It wouldn't happen again. Only it wasn't a one-off. You did it twice, Screwed both brothers when they were barely 18, which makes you nothing more than a whore. Claire recoiled from Steve's verbal attack. He never used foul language in her presence. I'm not like that. I was upholding a tradition, part of educating young men on the path to manhood, that's all. They were very appreciative. Claire realized she had made another mistake, barely saying it. Steve chimed in, "Oh, I bet they were so damn grateful. You say it was a one-time thing, but how many times did you do it before you educated them? Tell me how many times? If I'm 18 years old, I'm horny as hell. I want to give pleasure, and I've got a willing girl on hand for the evening and all night. It has to be at least 5 times a day, so maybe 35 times in a week. It's unlikely it was just one time." Claire couldn't deny it. Both Glenn and Jake were very eager to please. Very little training was required, although some patience was required at the beginning of the week. She savored their pumped and toned bodies. Just as her mother had predicted, the sex was exciting. She loved how turned on both young men were by being with her. She especially enjoyed teasing each of them with glimpses of stockings or cleavage, knowing that this night she would give herself completely to them. At one point, Jake had even admitted that he was in love with her. It was the only time it occurred to her that the week might affect her regular life and the marriage she so valued, and she wasted no time in explaining to Jake the reality of what was happening. Steve's stream of speech didn't stop. "And what exactly does an 18-year-old need these days? I bet they've been looking out for you from day one, haven't they?" Claire sobbed. "It's not like that. It was supposed to be a fun adventure. It was just sex. I know it hurts your ego, but still I only want you, and it's you that makes me complete." Steve got angry. "I'd say it's more about trust and vows than ego. What about your wedding vows? Does tradition take precedence over that? It's not ego when your life partner betrays you, and for what? Not for anything serious or serious consequences, but for a quick hookup with some fucking kids." Claire blushed. "I realize you're angry and upset with me, but you're strong enough to get us through this. After Glenn, you didn't learn anything, didn't notice anything, and we've grown closer, more related. I thought it would be the same with Jake. I didn't know because I trusted the woman I loved so dearly. Believe me, I would never do anything like that again." "Trust you? Trust me? You've got to be kidding me!" Claire almost shouted back. "You can do it! I swear! I'm really sorry for hurting you. Think of the beautiful life we still have left. We can go back to the way things were." "Did you think about our beautiful life when you were planning all this and lying on your back?" "No, I would never have thought about it if I had known the consequences. I would never intentionally hurt you. But I did it anyway. I know, and I'm really sorry." "And how do you think that turned out?" Claire didn't know what to say. "Obviously, you don't understand how I feel. You ripped out my heart and soul. How the hell can you fix it, Claire?" With those words, Steve rushed away before he did something he would regret later. He just kept walking, trying to clear his head, the beauty of the evening sunset doing little to improve his mood. When he turned back towards the village, he was surprised to see Yeoman Helen Brown. Steve barely managed a nod of greeting. Helen smiled and admitted that their meeting was no coincidence. She had seen Steve out on the path leading to the cliff and knew she could catch up with him as he made his way back. Helen suggested a seat on the rock ledge and then cautiously asked Steve if he would tell her anything about his circumstances. Steve saw no reason to be silent and told her everything. Saying it aloud did not take the weight off his shoulders. Helen listened attentively without interrupting. He hesitated to mention Diana's suggestion that one of the elders have sex with him in exchange for Claire honoring her commitment, but decided that Helen had a part to play in the whole saga and included it verbatim. When he finished, Helen was silent for a long time before she said, "Steve, I made no such offer. Diane never mentioned or discussed any arrangement with me or Moira. It's not something we could consider. I can only think that Diana was trying to get you to admit or agree to sex with others outside of marriage to justify what they had planned." Steve was puzzled by her answer. Helen continued. "One more thing, Steve. Those arrangements mostly disappeared decades ago, and even then it was only the first night, never a week. The only elements that lasted a week were chores or planting, with one night of union at the end. Maybe Melissa, Diane, and Susan acted on circumstances. Steve only shook his head. Every time he began to come to terms with his wife's behavior, there was a new shock. Helen continued, saying that she would speak to Moira and take the necessary steps to have Diana stripped of her elder status. As far as she knew, this had never happened before, and it would be a scandal, but Diana's actions were inexcusable. In this day and age, elders are supposed to be doing community service and supporting the people of the island. Helen looked at Steve. "What are you going to do?" Steve shrugged. "I can't make her realize the consequences of her actions, and I'd like her to feel what I'm feeling right now." They sat in silence for a while before Steve noticed a faint smile at the corner of Helen's mouth. "What is it? What are you thinking?" Helen's smile widened as she began. "What if you stay with me for a week? No kidding. But we shouldn't let Claire and Diane know about it. We'll say that I feel honored to accept the agreement that was offered on my behalf as an elder. That way, you'll let Claire try her own medicine, and I'll torment Diana for getting my name involved in all this nonsense." At this prospect, Steve was delighted, but asked, "Wouldn't that ruin your reputation? I'm still a married man, and everyone would think—" Helen interrupted him. "First of all, I don't care what people will think. And secondly, sorry to say it, but almost the whole island already knows about your situation, Steve. The thought of everyone knowing was another blow, but it was replaced by a pleasant thought that Steve shared with Helen. No kidding, but I'd love to plant some trees for you. It would make Claire and Diane think twice." They laughed together and quickly got things settled. Steve went back to his house and quickly packed his things. All he explained to Claire was that, upon reflection, he had decided to accept her mother's kind offer of an island elder. And under the circumstances, a week with another woman would be more than reasonable. He left Claire sobbing and begging him not to. His stay with Helen was surprisingly comfortable. She proved to be great company and a wonderful cook. Steve spent time renovating the house and actually planted some trees in the backyard. They discussed Steve's situation. He hoped this week would give Claire some insight into how he was feeling. Until he saw a lot more that would convince him that Claire realized how wrong her actions had been, they had no chance of reconciliation. True to his word, he never slept with Helen, although they had come very close to doing so a couple of times, and it hadn't been for lack of desire. It wasn't long before Claire caught up with Helen in the village store and immediately began to berate her about her affair with her husband. Helen smiled sweetly. "Claire, dear, you of all people should know that it is not an affair. It is an arrangement, and it will not affect your marriage." Claire heard the echo of her own words, but continued. "You can't do that. He's my husband. In fact, I am honoring a proposal made by your own mother on my behalf. What was it? Me, Moira, or even your mom for a week? I think Steve made his choice, and I owe it to him to honor the tradition. It could have been worse. He could have chosen Diane. I promise to bring him back safe and sound, although he may be a little worn out." Claire gasped. You slut?" Helen calmly replied, "I would have thought that name more appropriate for one of us who slept with two 18-year-old boys behind her faithful husband's back." With those words, Helen promptly walked away, leaving Claire with her mouth hanging open and everyone in the village store staring at her. The next day, a furious and hysterical Claire made a dignified attempt to kick Helen's front door in until Steve opened it. "Please, Steve, I'm so sorry. Come home. I'm just doing what you did. Why are you so upset? Because, like you said, it shouldn't concern us." "I had no idea. It's just cruel. It's torturing me. I can't stop thinking about you with that bitch." Steve replied, "Yeah, sounds familiar. Welcome to my world," and quickly slammed the door shut. Back at his house, Steve returned the following week and was greeted by a much more subdued Claire. Claire began, "I can't believe you did this to me, but I can forgive you if you can. I understand how you feel about all of this." "You only think you do. You've still only experienced part of it, not the deceit and lies. Our whole time here is based on lies." Claire persisted. "We're still the same people, the same marriage. The same marriage that inspired you to jump into bed with other men, the marriage you destroyed, and I still can't understand why you did it. Am I really that annoying to you?" "It was never about you or boredom. If we can't go back, we can build something new. Let's look forward to all those retirement dreams, for the things we could have together, travel, grandchildren. We can still do all those things. We still love each other no matter what. It's not over, Steve. I will do anything to prove my love for you." Steve stayed in the house in the spare room, almost overcome with frightening thoughts of what the hell to do with his life if he left Claire. He couldn't decide what best described his prospects: failure or abyss. Staying was easier, and he still loved her. Given the consequences, he doubted Claire's actions would be repeated. The island was idyllic, and he'd dreamed of traveling, spent years planning options and sharing those dreams with Claire. Did he really want to give it all up? Claire pondered how it had come to this. It was all so confusing. When her mom had offered a settlement, she had rejected the offer, but Diana had continued to hit on her for months. Then she saw Glenn Fraser at a dance. He was very handsome and delightfully respectful. She danced with him several times at social evenings, and they got along well. Diana told her about her own arrangements and how exciting those were. She spoke of it as a guilt-free romantic adventure and never viewed it as an affair. It was just a tradition. Even so, she realized that Steve didn't see it that way, so she kept it all hidden. If he never found out, it wouldn't hurt him. The week with Glenn was fantastic. He planted trees during the day and spent his evenings in her bed. He was very nervous, but he was very charming and so eager to please. By the end of the week, he had become a very competent lover, combining his size and physicality with great patience and technique. Claire, on the other hand, excelled in her role as an educator. The week had filled her with confidence. She felt she had rediscovered her sexuality that had faded over many years of motherhood. Was it tradition or just illicit sex, as Steve had suggested? She had to admit it was both, but didn't she deserve a little pleasure after spending 22 years raising children and being a good wife? She was sure it hadn't hurt her relationship with Steve. Things had never been better. She loved him more than ever, and after that week they had made love more often. Jake was even more beautiful, and she couldn't escape the excitement at the thought of taking him into her bed. Steve had always been smart and revealed tradition, and Aunt Melissa's memoirs be damned for giving it all away. Claire and her mother tried to convince Steve to go along with it, but he wouldn't go for it. On reflection, her decision to go behind his back was the worst decision she had ever made. However, she was sure that when the pain subsided, she could get Steve back. She would just need to remind him of how good they were together and of their future aspirations. He would also want to stay together because of their daughters and future grandchildren, and that angle could help her case. To Steve's surprise, their daughters arrived on the island 2 days later. Nicole wasted no time in criticizing Steve for his horrible behavior toward her mother, pointing out that the idea of separation was ridiculous. Michelle seemed to linger, waiting for more information. Steve noticed the slight smile on Claire's face. Had he not noticed her manipulations and lies over the years? Apparently, she thought he would not tell his daughters anything about their mother's actions, as always protecting them first. All of Steve's doubts dissipated, but Claire was wrong. Completely wrong. Now, Steve raised his voice in a way his daughters could never recall. "Your mother had been having affairs for 2 weeks with men. Boys. Younger than both of you, actually. She doesn't seem to understand that I would never accept such behavior." Claire immediately refuted this, saying that Steve had misunderstood the situation and that the men were just doing landscaping work. Steve had to admit that she was good, almost convincing even him. Both girls knew something was up, but what their father was suggesting was too far-fetched. Perhaps he was starting to get a little crazy. Steve might have agreed with the last thought, but suggested they invite Grandpa Bill or the elders to help them decide who was telling the truth. Claire fainted, or rather pretended to. It wasn't very convincing. All three only looked at her perplexed and waited for an equally poorly thought-out recovery. Steve looked at her contemptuously. "I can never trust you again. It's over. There's no going back, or forward with blinkers on. How will you feel when you look in the mirror and know you betrayed me? Nothing can erase that. And how will I feel looking in that same mirror if I accept that?" We need each other, Steve. We've always depended on each other. It's made each of us stronger. I'm right for you, and deep down you still know it. Don't throw your life away to punish me. I can handle it, Claire, but I won't let you destroy me and build a new life. We all have to live with our choices and be true to ourselves. You have to live with the fact that you cheated, lied, and threw away what we had. I, on the other hand, will have to live with the fact that I left the woman I love. But you are not who I thought you were, not the good and kind person I fell in love with. I wish I could have her back, but not you. Steve left the island with his daughters and decided to rent an apartment closer to their university. In turn, the girls were shocked by the behavior of their mother and grandmother. He never returned. His last act was to burn the trees in the orchard. Claire watched the orange blaze with tears in her eyes. Bill helped Steve sell the house as Claire did not have enough money to maintain it. Diana and Claire's divorce was a scandal and sealed the fate of the remnants of the tradition. Diana became the first to be removed as an elder. Both she and Claire became outcasts. No woman trusted or befriended them, but despite this, they resolutely continued to live on their island. A few months later, Helen Brown stepped down as an elder. The islanders noticed that she was dividing her time between being on and off the island. Eventually, she began to come only a couple weeks a year. When asked about this, she confirmed that she lived with her family somewhere near a place called Durham.